Long before soldiers manned the guns at Fort Columbia, before American towns sprang up along the Columbia River, before outside explorers arrived in sailing ships, Chinook Indian people lived at the mouth of the waterway they simply called the Great River. They fished in the river for fine, fat salmon, using huge seining nets they wove out of plants and anchored with specially carved stones. They traveled in cedar log canoes and lived in lodges of split cedar planks that housed several families at once. From their advantageous position at the mouth of the Great River Highway, the Chinook became skillful traders. By trading with tribes to the north, they acquired such things as whale oil and the highly prized shells called dentalium. By trading with interior tribes far up the Columbia River, they obtained starchy wapato roots and glassy volcanic obsidian for making weapons and tools.
That's well, haul taut and belay.
In 1792, American sea captain Robert Gray piloted the first sailing ship into the mouth of the river. While anchored off Chinook Point, where Fort Columbia stands today, Gray named the magnificent waterway after his ship, Columbia. 13 years later, in 1805, the Lewis and Clark expedition reached the Pacific Ocean on their famous overland journey to explore the vast Northwest. Captains Meriwether Lewis and William Clark found the Indians of the lower Columbia River to be savvy, experienced traders.
Those people ask generally double and triple the value of what they have to sell, and never take less than the real value of the article in such things as is calculated to do them service, such as blue and white beads, with which they trade with the natives above, files, which they make use of to sharpen their tools, fish hooks of different sizes, and tobacco. Tobacco and blue beads they do prefer to everything. Captain William Clark.
For more than 50 years, both the United States and Great Britain claimed ownership of the Northwest. As early as 1820, Congress discussed building coastal forts at the mouth of the Columbia River, both to strengthen America's claim and to guard against foreign invasion. But when the boundary with Britain was settled in 1846, the forts had still not been built. In 1862, an exasperated Senator Nesmith of Oregon requested $100,000 for defenses at or near the mouth of the Columbia River.
By the neglect of the executive government, or of Congress, or of somebody, there is not today a single gun mounted, nor a defensive work thrown up, nor has there ever been a dollar expended by the government for the defense of that coast from the harbor of San Francisco north. Today, a gunboat of the meanest and most ordinary character could ascend the Columbia River and destroy every town upon it. Destroy Portland, our metropolis of trade. Not of as much importance as the Portland where the senator from Maine resides, but it is of very great importance to us, and we desire that it be protected. Senator James W. Nesmith, Oregon.
By 1865, 2 coastal forts were finally in place. Fort Canby on the Washington side, and Fort Stevens on the Oregon side of the entrance to the Columbia. A third fortification was planned for Chinook Point, 6 miles inside the entrance. But when the Civil War came to a close before the third fort was started, the War Department postponed its plans for fortifying the river. It was not until 1896, as part of a nationwide effort to update coastal defenses, that construction finally began on Fort Columbia. In the 30 years since the Civil War, dramatic improvements had been made in the design of heavy artillery. Iron cannons that were loaded awkwardly at the muzzle gave way to enormous steel rifles that loaded rapidly from behind. Traditional seacoast defenses have been massive brick or stone fortresses that concentrated firepower by stacking up courses of guns. But the new, more powerful, longer-range rifles used ground-hugging concrete platforms that blended into the landscape. In 1897, work began on the first of 3 batteries at Fort Columbia. Battery Ord was designed to accommodate 8-inch rifles mounted on an ingenious apparatus known as a disappearing carriage. A lead counterweight weighing 55 tons hung in a well below the gun, holding the huge rifle down in its level loading position. When the weight was released, the rifle rose up to fire over the concrete wall. The force of the recoil then drove the gun back behind the protective parapet and into its loading position again. Tools, ammunition, and powder were stored on the battery's lower level. To ready the guns for firing, shells and powder were wheeled from their separate magazines to hoists, like dumbwaiters, across the corridor. The hoists moved the ammunition up to the loading platform, where it was rushed to the waiting rifles. On the bluff below Battery Ord, 2 6-inch disappearing guns were installed at Battery Murphy. Nearby Battery Crenshaw was equipped with 3 3-inch rapid-fire guns that could be aimed and fired at great speed. These were for use against minesweepers or other small enemy boats that might manage to slip upstream. Along with the modern artillery, underwater explosives were used to protect the Columbia River. Clusters of floating mines, anchored 5 feet below the surface, were linked by electrical cables to the mining station, or casemate, at Fort Columbia. These were designed to detonate only when purposely fired from shore, allowing friendly vessels to sail through the minefield unharmed. Observation stations on Scarborough Hill, high above Fort Columbia, allowed soldiers to scan the horizon for possible enemy ships. After dark, searchlights were used to help pinpoint a target's location. If a possible target was sighted, observers telephoned its position to officers in the plotting room, whose job was to chart the ship's progress and plot its probable course. If mines were needed, firing orders would be telephoned to the casemate. If guns were required, aiming instructions were phoned to the batteries. It was, for its time, an extremely advanced system of defense, one that required constant training, and soldiers who could perform, as one colonel wrote in the 1890s, with smartness, coolness, self-reliance, and discipline. The first regular garrison of troops arrived at Fort Columbia in the summer of 1903. For the next 14 years, the fort would be home to approximately 4 officers and 100 enlisted men. With its tidy frame buildings and wood plank streets, the isolated post was like a small self-contained town. It had a hospital, a barber shop, a soda fountain, a bowling alley, a guardhouse with a jail for those who broke the rules, and later a small movie house. A central power plant burrowed into the hillside away from the guns generated electricity for lights and telephone lines. The largest home at the post was assigned to the fort commander. It boasted all the modern features of the early 1900s: central steam heat, indoor plumbing, electric lights, and fancy tin ceilings. Furniture, knickknacks, and dishes arrived with each new commander's family and went with them to their next post. Enlisted men were housed and fed in a 2-story wooden barracks. The main floor kitchen and mess hall were ruled by the company mess sergeant, whose duties ranged from planning the meals to inspecting clean hands before dinner and hushing loud talk at the tables. Dormitories were furnished with rows of basic iron cots and upright wooden lockers. This was where men could relax and read, or write to their families back home. In addition to training daily against possible naval attack, the soldiers were sometimes called to fight in the war against bed bugs as well.